quick reminder that the purpose of InterReach is a dual mission. InterReach brings together people who make cross-disciplinary problem solving possible. So we share practices, tools, and ideas for strengthening this work and building clear, sustainable career paths for our boundary-spanning roles. And our community focuses its efforts both on developing the profession itself, but also professional development. And so that's part of why we are here today in this webinar. Oh, excuse me. We're celebrating the 10th anniversary of the I2 Insights, or Integration and Implementation Insights blog and repository. And this is hosted by Gabrielle Bammer and Peter Dean of the Australian National University. And the purpose of this blog is to share ideas and tools for integration and implementation. It helps formalize the integrative skill sets and advances transdisciplinary approaches to tackling complex societal and environmental challenges. So this is our April webinar in this series, and we structured this as a type of a dialogue. We're going to have a 10-minute presentation by each of our two guests today, and then they're going to take 10 or 15 minutes to have a dialogue between themselves, ask questions, and then we'll open it up to the broader community. So the title of today's webinar is I2 Insights on Building Competency, and joining us as our guest speakers are Michelle Bennett of LM Bennett Consulting and Stephen M. Fiore of the University of Central Florida. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Both of our speakers have an amazing history, so I'm going to kind of shorten this just a little bit so we can dive straight into the good stuff. Michelle Bennett began her career as a molecular oncologist before shifting focus to collaborative science and team effectiveness. And she served as the founding director of the National Cancer Institute's Center for Research Strategy and has spent 20 years at the National Institutes of Health in various leadership roles. She's a certified executive coach, and she is now principal and owner of LM Bennett Consulting, LLC, where she works with teams and organizations across sectors globally. And she's also a fantastic author. She's co-authored Collaboration and Team Science, a field guide, and released her newest book just last November on how to succeed at collaborative research, a practical guide for teams. And Michelle, I'm going to stop sharing and let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Allison. Really appreciate the invitation to be here and to chat with folks a bit. I'll pull up my slides. Just a second here. My share button is acting wonky. Here we go. All right, so can you see my slides okay? It was tough to try to think, well, what do I really want to say in 10 minutes, and thinking about speaking to this audience. So many people already so knowledgeable about team science, collaboration principles, different arenas. So I think what I did is just decided to focus a little bit on the blog posts that I contributed to the blog post that you're celebrating this year. And also, I think, just share a little bit about my philosophy as I think about team science and collaboration. So I started in this area probably around 2008, 2009. That's when my interest really started emerging. And I think pretty quickly I found myself in what I would describe as more of a practitioner stance, a practitioner perspective, than I did kind of set myself into the scholarly perspective. And I think my interest in trying to help teams really emerged from being in a situation where I needed to work with teams, and I needed to learn how to help them move from the forming stage through the storming stage into norming and performing, just to use a well-known model. So when I work with people, when I work with teams, when I work with individuals, I tend to focus on a few things. And I think for today, I wanted to try to figure out, what could I share with you that maybe might be most interesting or impactful, or what do I think of as some of the major leverage points. So I think it's really easy to get in front of a group of people, have them sit in a group and ask them how they know when a team is working well and when a team is not working well. I think if we were to do breakout rooms, everybody could have a lot to contribute in this space. I think we know innately, we know from experience what works and what doesn't work and what might be contributing to making things work and what might be getting in the way. So two really great examples is setting expectations. People often say accountability, trust, psychological safety. Those are things that emerge a lot. So the what is easy. Shifting to the how is much, much more difficult. I think it's really easy to say, and I think one of my favorite examples is, okay, it's New Year's Day, I'm going to start jogging every day. Well, I think we all know that New Year's resolutions don't tend to work very well because typically what we're saying is we want to change our behavior without necessarily thinking about our mindset or changing our mindset. And so that's what makes it so difficult for teams in who are trying to collaborate be very effective. They know what effectiveness looks like, but they don't necessarily know how to be effective. And that's very much where I think of my work coming in, is helping people learn how to move from what to how, or from theory to action. So why is this important? I don't think I need to tell this group why it's so important. I think it's the what makes it so hard. And I think, I wanted to be very intentional today about saying what makes it so hard is when things get dicey, when things get messy, when things get challenging. That's what makes it so hard. I think everybody can think of a time when they loved being on a team. It was like clockwork. It was so easy. People got along really well. There weren't really massive disagreements. When there were disagreements, that they were able to get through it really comfortably. And so you say, well, that's working, that's fabulous. But as soon as somebody takes something personally, as soon as there's tension in the room, all of those things that you might know how to do when we're all feeling really good about what's going on kind of goes out the wall. Our emotions kick in, our feelings kick in, our defenses go up, and that's what makes it so hard. So when I think about moving from theory to action, I'm thinking about building skills, building abilities that we can use in the moment, even when frustrations are high, even when there's a lot of difficulty or challenge in the room. So I put at the bottom, what are the greatest leverage points? So I'm just going to share a couple of places where I think there's a lot of leverage. The first of all is introducing people to the concept of a collaborative team mindset. When you think of a group who's going to be working together collaboratively, I don't think we as facilitators or team members ourselves or people who are helping teams get launched, that we're necessarily very mindful of the fact that it can be really beneficial to ask the team how they want to be in relationship with each other. So when we think about mindset, there are a couple predominant types of mindsets. There's a collaborative mindset. You could also say a mutual learning mindset, depending upon who you've read and what you've studied. There's also a unilateral mindset. So collaborative mindset is things like transparency, curiosity, reliability, conscious choice, and being fully present with other people. Yet typically, as we are raised, we end up being able to be very unilateral, especially when we're in situations that are difficult or challenging or where we're afraid or nervous. So in these situations, we can adopt a right versus wrong. We can be very judgmental. We can think that we want to win conversations. A lot of times we blame and or we try to protect ourselves through defensiveness. So I raised this. This is one of the blogs that I wrote that is part of the overall series, so that you have the link here. And there's a lot more detail on it. But as I have worked with people and I've worked with teams, again, we're talking about mindset. Mindset influences how we act and how we conduct ourselves with our teams, as well as the types of norms that we put in place, as well as the types of agreements that we put in place. It's all connected, and it's all described in the blog. But I think just to make it really easy, I'll sometimes invite people to think about, okay, well, what's one mindset shift that you could make today? Well, here's the kind of the biggest mindset shift that you could make today, and I challenge you to think about implementing this all week, and that is accepting all offers. So this is the exercise in letting go and being non-judgmental. We are really good about when somebody offers us a gift of saying, no, I don't want it. Or that's really nice, but it's not wrapped the right way, or I don't want to I don't want to see what's inside. It's kind of our way of saying, I don't think your idea is a very good one. So if we were to be completely open and accepting of every offer that came to us, whether it feels good or not, that's one step in the direction of opening up the container for more collaboration, better conversation, greater curiosity, and greater innovation. And the trick here is that when you are feeling tense or uneasy, or something's happened in the room where there's a little bit of tension, accepting offers can be very difficult because we're asking you to be completely vulnerable and just say yes to the other person. It doesn't mean you need to agree, but it does require saying yes and being open to possibility. Another dimension that I focused pretty heavily on alone, and also with my collaborators, Michael O'Rourke and Edgar Cardenas, is in collaboration agreements. So a couple of years ago, we posted a collaboration agreement post. We did a blog on that. And at the same time, made the collaboration agreement in a generic form freely available at this Zenodo site. We had just been able to take this collaboration agreement template that we actually developed for the National Science Foundation, one of their programs, and we were permitted to put it into a generic form and post it. As I just looked the other day, it now has more than 5,000 views and 3,000 downloads, which felt pretty good. But I think one of the things that I would articulate is that, there's so much discussion in teams about some very, very fundamental needs. One of them is building trust. Another is building psychological safety. Another is setting expectations. And another is creating a shared vision. Collaboration agreements turn out to be really phenomenal ways of doing all of those things. They don't need to be done all at once, but if people think about developing a collaboration agreement in the same way as they think about developing their research plan, that can go a long way to really help the team succeed. We followed up that particular post with a couple of other posts with so again, work that was derived from our work with the National Science Foundation. And it talked about the role of confidentiality and anonymity in teams. So the test of a truly psychologically safe team would be the following. I put a survey together. We ask all of the team members to fill it out, and then we ask you at the very end to sign your name so that you kind of own all of the data that you have contributed, and you're willing to share it with others. In truly psychologically safe teams, people might be willing to sign their name, but if it's not truly psychologically safe, they are likely not to be. So we wrote a couple of blogs that basically talks about how do you move a team from not being completely psychologically safe to psychologically safe. And basically you use all of the same collaborative mindset principles or foundations. Those are the pieces that come together that create the foundation for being able to shift from non-psychologically safe or under psychological threat to psychologically safe. So we think that's a really important part of being teams and just thought it would be a great something to share. Lately, I have had a really strong focus on helping people think about listening. I have learned, I have seen that people don't necessarily get trained in how to listen. So I developed an exercise that I call the listening ladder. It's listed here, and instead of being on the blog post that we're celebrating, it's actually on my website's blog posts. I did a couple of them. So if you're interested in that, those are there. But I think we make a lot of assumptions when we assume that we are good listeners because I don't think we listen as well as we think we do often. I think the last thing I just kind of want to say is that I have been doing a fair amount of training lately and helping people learn how to collaborate, to facilitate in a collaborative manner. So I call it collaborative facilitation. I think the thing that I would say about this is it really requires that if you're going to be a collaborative facilitator, you need to act and behave in ways that are fully congruent with the collaborative mindset. Because you need to be modeling in everything that you do those principles of collaboration while you're working with the team so that they can eventually learn how to facilitate their own groups and or if it's more of a train the trainer model, which I'm also doing, those people can step away and have had a good role model for what that looks like. The two books were mentioned. One, the field guide, is available freely at my website, and then this just came out in November, which has been really exciting. So I want to thank you all very much. I hope I didn't take too much time, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So thank you.
That was spot on. Thank you, Michelle. We might have, excuse me, time if anyone has a pressing question right now, or we can move on to our next. And I'm going to also drop a few links to just some of Michelle's many blog posts at I2 Insights for you to take a look at as well.
Thank you, Allison.
You're very welcome. All right.
Okay, let me get my share set up.
Yes. Do you want to go ahead and share, Steve, or shall I to do your introduction?
You can go ahead and share to do the introduction.
I will do that. Oh, my goodness. Sometimes I feel like technology never cooperates when I'm in a hurry. All right. Fantastic. Here we go. So again, many accomplishments here to elaborate on, but I'm just going to kind of summarize. Dr. Stephen Fiore is a director or is the director of the Cognitive Sciences Laboratory and Pegasus Professor at the University of Central Florida's Institute for Simulation and Training. And his multidisciplinary research spans cognitive, social, and computational sciences, focusing on complex collaborative cognition and human technology interactions. He's a founding board member and past president of both the International Network for the Science of Team Science, many of us know this as Insights, and the National Interdisciplinary Network for Group Research. And he has also co-authored some publications, the National Academy's Consensus Studies on Team Science in 2015 to 2025, and he's edited or co-authored several books on teams and shared cognition and over 250 scholarly publications on learning, memory, and problem solving. So thank you all. I'm going to welcome Steve and hand it over to you.
Okay, so it's great to have this opportunity to talk about some of the contributions to Gabrielle's blog. This has really been a tremendous resource, I think, for a lot of us. And it's been fun to work with her because if you have contributed to the blog, you know she puts in a lot of effort to make it much more readable, to take our obtuse academic writing and turn it into something that people can understand. So I just selected a few of the blogs, and I thought I'd give a little bit of the backstory to them and just hit the main points. And This one actually goes back 2 decades now. It was a talk I gave at one of the first conferences for the Interdisciplinary Network for Group Research. It was a brand new organization, and it was the second conference, and they wanted to have a panel on interdisciplinarity. And I had been doing interdisciplinary research for a few years. I had not yet started to study it. So this was 2006, a couple of years away from my 2008 paper in small group research. So what I did was just reflect on my experience of working with people from different disciplines and trying to capture some of what I had seen in their behavior, in their attitudes, and in their cognition. And I titled this the ABCs of Interdisciplinarity. And with regard to attitude, you can see this is a blend of positive and negative components of what I had seen. So one of the most shocking things was this kind of disciplinary disdain. So keep in mind, 2006, 20 years ago, I was fairly young. I myself was kind of naive, and it was a little disappointing to see this lack of respect that the disciplines held for each other because I had grown up in a number of different interdisciplinary institutes and research laboratories. And then when I got my first real job, it was a shame to see this kind of disciplinary disdain. And the complement to that was this disciplinary arrogance, where some of these other disciplines just felt that they were better than other disciplines, and they would bring that to the table in their interactions with them. But the positive part of this was what I would call disciplinary tolerance, and this is where you're working with people, and they really are interested and they want to hear your ideas, they want to engage with you, and they're open to this kind of input from people outside their disciplines. So then thinking about the behaviorals that I had seen, one that was kind of interesting to me was this disciplinary apprehension. And this is something I'm sure you all have experienced yourself, or you know people who have experienced this. And this is the people who, although they may be intrigued by and want to engage in interdisciplinarity, everything is telling them not to. They're getting mentoring. They may be hearing from their department chair or colleagues like, no, you don't want to do interdisciplinary. Just focus on your own discipline, publish in your own journals. So I just labeled this disciplinary apprehension. And then there's another kind of behavior was what I call disciplinary ignorance. It was just a will for ignorance, a lack of intellectual curiosity to try to understand what's going on outside their own discipline. I was really shocked by that because people just thought that their discipline could solve everything, and they didn't want to pay attention to what any other disciplines may have to say or to contribute to a particular problem that they were trying to solve. But on the positive side, there's this idea of benevolence, and this is when you don't know anything about a discipline, you're working with them, and these are people who are not simply interested in hearing your opinion, but willing to take the time to teach you. And this has been very helpful over the years for me because collaborating with a lot of people in very complicated disciplines, they'll take the time to explain things carefully to me. And this actually started in undergraduate, but probably most relevant to this community is in graduate school when my PhD was in cognitive psychology, but I was interested in groups and teams. I ran into a social psychologist who I had heard had a seminar on groups and teams, and I said, "Hey, would you be willing to teach that again?" And these were two social psychologists, John Levine and Dick Moreland, who were famous groups and teams researchers. They thought it would be fun to have it again. So they had this seminar, and they were very kind in explaining the social psychological concepts associated with collaboration that me as a cognitive psychologist was not familiar with. And this was, gosh, back in around 1994, I guess it was. And this was my first introduction to real scholarship on groups and teams. And they were very open-minded. They were excited that people from outside social psychology were interested in this. So it was a great opportunity to be taught from very knowledgeable people. And then there's the cognitive components, the disciplinary myopia. This is related to the ignorance, but it's just an inability to even comprehend the possibility that other disciplines have something to contribute to the particular problems that you're trying to solve. And then there's disciplinary multilingualism. Everyone is familiar with that. This is probably the first thing people experience when they're working with other disciplines. That is that you're going to be speaking using the same terms. I called this kind of a negative common ground where you don't even realize that you're talking about different things, even though you're using similar concepts. But then there's the disciplinary naivete. This is the fresh insights out of the mouths of babes kind of phenomena where you come in and you know something or you see something that other people don't even realize because they've been so immersed in their own field that they can't even recognize a possibility that an outsider could come in and see. So I've seen this happen a lot. It's really a nice insight to experience. But this is kind of my overview of this cognitive shifts. And it's important to see these positive and negative components, because when you can identify the disdain, the apprehension, the myopia, you can think about how to overcome that. You can think about how to design for benevolence, for example, how to model the appropriate behavior, how to carefully explain to people. You heard Michelle talk a lot about listening. So this is an important part of overcoming some of these problems. Okay, so another blog that I wrote had to do with some work that I'd been doing with the program in international student assessment. This was an organization that every few years they test students around the world, high school students around the world, on a particular set of competencies. In 2015, they added the competency collaborative problem solving. So I got to work with them to try to come up with a framework on collaborative problem solving. Those results were published in 2017, and they were not very favorable. They did not look good. We found that only 30% of students around the world were any good at collaborative problem solving. A significant number of them scored at the lowest level of collaborative problem solving. So some of us who were working in this, we wrote a couple of papers. We wrote a commentary in Nature Human Behavior. We wrote a comprehensive review in Psychological Science and the Public Interest. So I decided to write something for the blog about this to try to get people engaged in how do you overcome the problems associated with this. And the punchline is we framed it around three core components, that is instruction, practice, and feedback, with the main idea being that if you really want to improve collaboration, you need to ensure that whatever is your intervention, you have these three components. So when it comes to instruction, you really need to teach people about teamwork. You don't just throw them into a group. You need to help them understand what are the competencies associated with collaboration. Why do you need to build shared cognition? What do we mean by knowledge building? So you need to ensure that they have some kind of understanding, some kind of instruction about the collaborative processes. Then the idea for practice was another component. That is, it's not simply enough to provide the instruction. You need to give them some kind of embedded opportunity in which to actually engage in the kind of behaviors necessary to get better at collaboration. We talked about a number of them. Problem-based learning, I think, is one of the more effective ones. But there's also studio-based learning, team-based learning. There's a number of different kinds of active learning approaches that focus on collaboration that you could pursue that gives an opportunity for practice. But probably the one that's missed the most, that's ignored the most, is assessment and feedback. And what matters here is that you're giving them feedback on their teamwork. You're not just telling them how they did on the output that they produce. And like in school, in undergraduates, it's like, did you get a good grade on the paper that you collaboratively wrote? No, that's not what the point of this kind of assessment is. The assessment here is focused on their collaborative competence. Did they communicate well? Did they share knowledge? Did they show the right attitudes? Were they helping to organize the task? So those kinds of specific assessments associated with the teamwork are what tends to be missing in any kind of environment where you see students thrown into group work. So the point was to get people to understand that you need to have all three of these if you want people to get better at collaboration. You need the instruction, the practice, and the assessment. Now, most recently is based upon some work I've done with people from offices of research here in the state of Florida. These are research development professionals, and they were interested in trying to develop some interventions associated with collaboration and how to improve interdisciplinarity. So it fits in with what Michelle was talking about for facilitation. And out of this, we wrote a blog about one specific tool that was developed in order to focus on transactive memory systems. Simply put, it's a piece of shared cognition. Do you know who knows what on your team? So the point here with this intervention, this linking, relinking tool that we wrote about, is to overcome the assumption that you know what your teammates know and build a tool to make that explicit so they come to a collective awareness of the kind of complementary expertise associated with it. What's important here is it has built into it a kind of calibration where you have some self-perceptions associated with what not simply you're contributing, but what other people are contributing to it. And the important is you articulate what those perceptions are, and you're not allowed to Google what these people do or what they know. You have to try to base that upon, were you paying attention in the meeting, like Michelle was talking about? Were you carefully listening to what they were saying? And then you have a discussion with the team about that. And this is where you can calibrate. This is the explicit kind of communication where you can talk about, oh, I didn't really realize that this is what you do or this is what you understand. So this was a tool that is really facilitating overcoming some of the implicit team dynamics that might be there. You might have some assumptions. You may have some expectations that are unwarranted. And the tool helps make these things explicit. It helps them overcome some of the problems. And we wrote about it that it can be used in teams that have been around for a while. Maybe it's time for them to update their transactive memory systems. It could be an intervention for teams that are frustrated with each other, helping them force a kind of explicit communication about what they think they should be doing. But obviously, it's most facilitating for teams that are new, they don't really understand each other. And it's this kind of cognitive artifact, this kind of capability mapping that helps them understand. So this is just a screenshot of what the tool looks like, and you're supposed to talk about what your understanding of what it is that they do and how you can see it fitting in with what you want to accomplish. And this can be designed for any number of teams. This is just for a certain number, about a 4-member team. But again, the point here is to help them develop this shared cognition associated with their collaboration. And I'll end it there.
Very good. Thank you so much, Steve. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to both of you to have a little bit of a dialogue between you, and then we'll open it up. And in the meantime, I'm going to also share the links to those blog posts in the chat for everyone.
So I'm going to jump in, Steve. I'm really, really, really pleased we had a chance to present together, because I think so many of the things that you talk about are so nicely aligned with things that I shared as well. And so I'm trying to decide where to go first. I think this is where I'm going to go first, is just here at the end when you're talking about shared cognition and how teams can actually move from a place of let's just say shared frustration or shared anxiety with each other to a place of shared understanding. I think that's the place where we have the most leverage, is helping teams learn how to do that. And I think one of the things that came to mind as I was listening to you is the listening is important, but also kind of going back to the gifts, accepting what each other has to say, even in times of frustration, is really important to build that shared cognition. At least I think so. And so just curious as to what your reaction is to that.
Well, I think the first thing to recognize the challenge that we all have working with teams like this is the things that we recommend, the things that we try to do, this listening that you're talking about, the accepting of the gifts, what that really requires is time. That really requires that we have dedicated time set aside to have these kinds of reflective activities. And it's been my experience that a lot of teams don't want to do that. And you're right. It is important to listen to what people have to offer, be willing to accept that. But part of that acceptance needs to be a calibrated discussion about what you understand about what's being offered, what you understand about how that might fit with a particular project they're doing. And those are the kinds of things that we know as team researchers can facilitate the collaboration, but it's also the same kind of thing that the scientists don't like to do. They're really not comfortable doing. And I have data from a recent study that I just did where the number one thing they said they can't stand is reflective activity. They just want to get in and do things, and they
Yes.
like having these kinds of hackathons or these data meetings and just getting work done. But having them talk about the collaboration is uncomfortable. It's just not something that they enjoy.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I think one of the things that I've tried doing with more and more teams that I've worked with is encouraging them to take 10 minutes at a meeting, either at the start or the end of the meeting, and to do just a very simple, so what's been working, what hasn't been working, or what could we improve? Just a quick around the room to at least start to surface some of that. I think it's, to you say there's a lot of resistance in wanting to do that. And yet, I think many times once you give them the opportunity to go there, some really interesting conversations can occur. So let me give you one example. I was working with a number of teams. So we spent the morning doing kind of the research focus and kind of research strategic planning. And then in the afternoon, I invited them to shift to collaboration planning. And one of the teams was just kind of sitting there, sort of twiddling their thumbs. And I said, what's going on? And they're like, we get along great. We've had a lot of fun working together. There's really nothing that's going wrong. And I said, that's really fabulous. I'm really glad to hear that. I said, well, why don't you just take about 10 minutes and talk about whether or not you've been on a team before where things haven't gone well, and just maybe something that you would want to make sure doesn't go that same direction with this team. And I walked away. And about 10 minutes later, I came back and they had flip charts filled up and sticky notes filled up, and they all were able to land on something that they wanted to make sure wasn't repeated in this team. But time, there was no way that they would have had that conversation if they hadn't had the time to kind of sink in and let that I think percolate a little bit.
Mhm. Well, I think one of the key distinctions with what you had them do, though, was to separate the current team from prior teams.
Mm-hmm.
So humans are uncomfortable talking about their current collaboration, but what you did is you allowed them to talk about prior collaborations, and that separation they were more comfortable talking about and making explicit what went bad. So it's easy to talk about what went well. It's the confrontation, the potential conflict, the dynamics that emerge when things are not going well, and it takes a particular skill set to facilitate that or to be a leader in a team where that happens. So what you did, I think, that helped make it successful was say, let's not talk about this team. Let's talk about your prior experiences. What did you like? What didn't you like? And I think that separation is what's another crucial point, and that's an important part of new teams. I'm not sure how to address this apprehension that people have about confronting conflict. I mean, this is one of the challenges is, I'm not a counselor. I didn't get training in this stuff. And I think that's a different kind of competency. So you said yourself, you've been facilitating for a number of years, you've been practicing it. So you had to learn on the job, but we know that there are experts out there who have specific training in these kinds of issues. And that's something that I think we don't attend to enough in the team science community.
Yeah, the taking on the conflict and helping people think about how to work through that, I think, is definitely kind of an interesting space. And I think it's one of the spaces that creates the most angst for people when I'm working with them. Lately, I think my suggestion to folks has been along the lines of to work on thinking about conflict, personal conflict, a lot like you might think about scientific conflict, and see what types of data you can collect from the conversation. And so when I say data in a conversation, what was said, what was done, what was the interaction like, so that you can go back to the person and say, this is what, by paraphrasing, this is what I think I heard you say. Did I get that right? And then using that, if the person says, yeah, that's what I said, then being able to use that and say, this is what it made me think of, or this is how it made me react. And I wanted to share this with you because dot, dot, dot. But trying to help people think about being a little bit more direct with each other than trying to beat around the bush, I think I think can be helpful, and also it can be trust building.
Mhm. Okay, what I've got a question. I'm curious for you, given you've been immersed in this for so long, you've been reading the literature on teamwork while you've been doing all of this work. Based upon being embedded in practice, have you learned anything that you think can go back into the laboratory and try to inform theory? That is, have you read particular team process kind of theories that you think, well, I've learned something that could make that theory better, or they're just plain wrong? So, any of what you've learned over the years, how would you make recommendations to what I would call the team laboratory types as far as the kind of research they should be doing?
Yeah, I think so. I think, to be really honest with you, I think I have engaged in a continuous learning journey since I started this. And I would say that because I think I have taken a lot of what I have learned and I have put it into practice, and I continue to do that. So I would say that like take, for example, some of the mindset work. I think that that's really important, and it's really, it's in and of itself, it's not novel, right? But then I think as it's applied to, and we think about it in the context of one owns learning about how to collaborate, learning how to facilitate with a collaborative mindset, um, and then being able to put that into the practice of actually designing workshops and or events for people that are intended to leverage that collaborative mindset and the outcomes. So I would say, like, those are the types of things that I think I've been able to weave together to create and to build over time. And then you ask the question, well, how do you, like, the evaluative component, or have I written papers, or is there something that could be written? Um, I did a project, I've been involved in a project with Emory over the last year plus, where I've designed a train the trainer program for a cohort in Ethiopia. And so we're just in the process of now putting together a paper after year one where I've been doing a lot of that. So this is a really long-winded answer to your question, but I would say yes, continually, that I am taking things that I learn and I'm trying to put them back into what I do so that I can do what I do better. Did that answer your question?
Well, kind of, but it was more given you've been, like we said, you've been reading the literature, and based upon your experience, have you been able to identify not simply publishing your own work, but making recommendations for existing theory? So your collaborative mindset, I'm sure you came across in the literature, the collective orientation scale. This is something that Jim Driscoll developed back in the 2000s, and it's essentially, do people have they didn't use the term mindset, but do they have the kind of disposition that is necessary to work with each other? And they talked about it being a propensity that you have the characteristics that you enjoy working with people, but also you understand the purpose of shared goals. You understand the need for collaboration to have higher impact. So that's just one example where you've been working on your collaborative mindset. What would you recommend based upon what you've learned to those who have looked at other things like collective orientation?
So recommend to them in the context of things they could study? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, where what they did they miss anything based upon your experience working with so many teams in this collaborative mindset space?
Oh my gosh. I think that's a really hard question. Um, and I say that because every team I work with, and I'm gonna guess anybody else who's here who works with teams and is a practitioner, every team is different. And every team has its specific, I don't know, personality, challenge, opportunity. And so I think it's really hard for me to think about any one thing that might be missed or not missed, because every group that I've worked with has required me to bring different tools or different frames or different frameworks or different models in order to be successful in working with them.
Okay.
This is so fascinating, honestly. I think we can go ahead and open up to the broader audience, though. Does anyone have any questions that they have for our speakers today? And feel free to raise a virtual hand, or you can drop it in the chat, whichever works best for you. Okay. Well, while folks are thinking, I actually have one for you. Because you both touched on this sort of the why and the how, but one thing I've been very curious about as a novice facilitator in a lot of these team efforts and group discussions and group work is how useful or helpful is it for teams for you to take sort of a little bit higher level and say, not only are we going to do this activity, but here's why this activity matters. And I think it ties a little bit into what you were talking about. in terms of trying to build that psychological safety, trying to get people to open up a little bit. But is there, especially to your point, Steve, about sometimes it's really tough for people who focus on very fact-based science to be more open like that? Does it help them to understand that there is actually research that backs the reasons why we do some of the things we do and some of the practices that we have?
Yeah, I think that that's certainly crucial, and that's what I would consider one of the first things you need to understand doing any kind of facilitation. And it's actually related to disciplinary disdain and disciplinary arrogance, because when you're working with people outside the social sciences, they're not familiar with the nature of the research that's done. So that's sometimes one of the first things I'll ask is, how many of you are familiar with the social sciences? And maybe a couple will raise their hands, in workshops that I facilitated. And that right there lets me know that, okay, I need to help them understand that there is a science behind studying humans. And I've explained some of the data, but to your point, the way I characterize it to address this challenge is I acknowledge that they have been doing teamwork. I acknowledge that they probably are good at teamwork. And what I try to do is give them the conceptual grounding or the conceptual scaffold to help them understand what it is that they do. So it's like safety, everyone gets that. And I explained, what it means, why it's important. I always talk about the Google study that came out in the teens because that gets people excited. It was good data. It came from Google. But to give that kind of grounding and give that evidence makes them appreciate it even more. But the point is to give them the language, to give them the concepts associated with what they have been implicitly experiencing so they can talk about it better.
Yeah, I think just to build on what Steve said and maybe come at it from a little bit of a different perspective, Allison, I think, typically when I work with groups, I do a lot of workshops. And so in a workshop, we don't necessarily have time to set up a team learning project like you might in a course, right? To give them an opportunity to learn how to work together over time. But I do a lot of exercises and I do a lot of simulations just so that we can start to, or I can at least introduce them to the concept of how you might take this from theory to practice and what that's like. And I'd say during that process, definitely help make it clear to them what led me to do the exercise. Sometimes I'll even ask them at the end of the exercise, what do they think was my motivation for having them do the exercise? So working some of that reflection in that Steve had mentioned. And then, always, I say always, a lot of times I actually end my talks by saying something along the lines of, you can invite me here. We've had 3 hours of fun. It's been great. But, if people don't go away and take one or two of these things to practice, they're not going to be able to integrate them into what they do. But I think people in general are very curious, especially scientists, clinicians, people in the science. They want to know what's leading you to do this with us. Where's the data? So
Yes, thank you for that. Keenan has dropped a question in the chat. Have either of you considered or used other forms of cognition, such as what is brought forth by theater of the oppressed or clean language, to coalesce around embodied cognition and uncover mindsets, worldviews, etc.? And Keenan, feel free to elaborate on that if you like.
I think I'll just start with that. But yeah, it invokes precognition and also subconscious thinking. So it sort of can be, but it's pretty far out there for the scientific community. However, I've seen examples where it has been being used. So we've become more experimental in this scientific world in the years that I've been working in it. So I'm just wondering.
Did you say precognition?
Yes, just the
What
sort
what
of
does that mean?
precognition. Yeah, that's a good question for you to ask. The sort of the impetus before you actually have the idea. So I would say that's where mindset lives. The framework that your idea will then come out of. So it's the worldview that you hold.
Okay. Um, I don't, and I think I have heard you bring this up maybe in the Ocean Memory Project or in other ones, in some other setting. And it does sound intriguing, and I'm a firm believer of embodied cognition. And if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, it's the social cues of some kind of interaction are telling us something that their words are not. And there are different kinds of meetings. There's like participatory research, community based kind of collaborations where those kinds of things have probably been done. But I have not ever worked with anything like that. And I'd add that you probably need a very good facilitator for something along those lines. You would need a trained expert.
Yeah, I think so. And I'll just insert quickly before Michelle, if you have any input, that what you were saying to Michelle about a group having permission to talk about other teams they've been on gave it sort of that arm's length. Some of these practices can likewise give an arm's length because you're like clean language, you're talking through metaphors so that you get a shared understanding of each other's kind of where they're coming from, but it's a little bit arm's length because you're talking through metaphors.
Mhm.
So I guess if I were to build on anything that you or address your question, Keenan, and thanks for dropping it in there, your comment, is I think the clean language aspect kind of jumped out at me the most, and I say that because I think in when I work with teams. And even individuals or organizations, I think my approach is always to, as much as possible, keep the door open as much as possible with my questioning, open-ended questions, because I think that reflects a true and very deep curiosity in working with people. If we ask leading questions or questions that are too narrow, they can be interpreted as being leading and as though I've already figured out the answer. And I think that's a place I try to avoid. And I try to encourage people to do that with each other as well.
All right, thank you. And again, feel free to raise your virtual hand or drop a question in the chat. We've had a couple in here. There's one from Carolyn. It looks like, while I'm not surprised to hear that scientists would dislike reflective practices, I'm wondering if you can share more about why you think so many folks have such a negative feeling about these practices. And we've got a couple of responses, but feel free if you want to elaborate a little bit on that, Michelle.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I was just thinking, like, I was at Stanford last week and we spent, I did a workshop with them, and I would say that in general, the scientists and the clinicians that I was working with, it was everybody that I was working with was from the med school. I would say they enjoyed the reflective opportunity, and they enjoyed doing that. I think the tension I have seen in teams that are actually taking on a project is it's really hard to justify spending time, like putting a whole hour aside to just talk about how we're going to work together, because they see the science as being so, like, that's what they need to focus on if they're going to be successful. So I think it's more of a choice, like where are we going to have the greatest value. I think it's hard for them to see how valuable working on how they're going to collaborate is until or unless they've had somebody on the team who's had a really good experience, or who has had a team really fall apart and say, yeah, we really need to do this. Is that clearer?
Yes.
Yeah,
So,
I can add to that because it does fit with this whole educational mindset about collaboration and the need to uh, ensure that teaching teamwork, teaching group process happens earlier. Because if you expose them to that and explain to them that you're not just learning about a task. So you may have heard me talk a lot about teamwork versus task work, and what they get focused on in the classroom is task work, but they never learn the teamwork. So I mentioned that the ABCs one that I gave was from 2006, but a lot of my initial ideas was based upon a center proposal I was working on for NSF in the early 2000s. And we had exactly this reaction. I was a co-PI on this project, and the PI was like, very sharp about collaboration and the challenges. And he created what he called articles of collaboration. So this was probably around 2003. And the scientists were like putting their hands up. Why are we wasting time talking about this? We need to write a research proposal and come up with a 5-year plan for complicated experiments across universities. And you want to spend time on this articles of collaboration. And they just didn't get it. They were really clueless about why that mattered. So it was incredibly difficult to get them to appreciate the complicated nature of the kinds of collaborations that they were going to be getting into as a research center. So it's both an unwillingness and uncomfortableness, but also a lack of awareness. So this ignorance, and ignorance is not simply something that's negative. It's just like they just don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another comment in the chat from Chris, who's kind of building on this. Facilitators separate competence about the research and competence about collaboration. So if researchers, quote, don't like reflective practices, what about mobilizing their research content into their reflection about collaboration? Does that work better, or is it hard to parse out?
I can go, or do you want to go, Michelle?
Um, I think the only thing I would say is that I think the conversation that I will oftentimes have with researchers is that the better their relationship and team dynamics, the better the science is going to be. I help them understand that they really go hand in hand. But I'll pass it over to you, Steve.
Sure. Yeah, I think what Chris is talking about there aligns with what I just said about teamwork versus task work. And just to go further with that, when people ask, how do you get better at collaboration? I always say, well, find something on which you can collaborate. So in the context of workshops or professional development that spans a certain amount of time, we always try to design some product, some expected outcome that they should be doing. So that's the practice component of what I talked about with instruction, practice, and feedback. So give them something on which to work that demands their interdisciplinary expertise. So that's what Chris is talking about, the research component. And out of that, interaction about the task work should be coming the awareness of the collaborative concepts that were introduced to them. So the confusion coming from trying to understand another person's perspective based upon their disciplinary expertise. So that's what I think, getting them to separate the teamwork from the task work, but giving them the task work activity that requires they collaborate, that requires they think about their disciplinary perspectives and how they can fit together, is the way through which to introduce the collaborative concepts.
Wow. Well, Michelle, you're right. I think this is that we're just barely scratching the surface of this, but we are a few minutes past the top of the hour here. So thank you both so much for joining us today. This has been absolutely fascinating. I know I've learned a lot. Um, just a quick reminder that we have our next session on May 12th on integration frameworks with Christian Pohl and Stephen Crowley. So we hope the rest of you can join us then. And again, let's give another round of thank yous for our wonderful speakers today.
Yep. Thank you. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Lots of fun.